If you guys have been following my Facebook page for a while, you will have heard me use the term pelvic collapse injury. And I've renamed that in the last year from sprung pelvis. Sprung pelvis was the terminology that was first introduced to me 2 years ago when I first started dissecting horses. And that terminology actually comes from human medicine, where the pelvis actually remains as a fibrocartilage connection along the pubis symphysis. So that's your joint at the front of the pelvis, at the pubic bone. And in humans, it remains a fibrocartilage connection because it is meant to move slightly, okay? And pubis diastasis, or sprung pelvis, as its layperson term, is where the pelvis pulls apart, an incredibly painful condition. It can happen through sports, and it's really common through childbirth in women. When I was first introduced to that idea, I thought, doesn't really fit, because the pelvis in a horse actually collapses inwards, and in a human it springs outwards. So sprung pelvis makes sense in that regard. And the more I saw this injury in horses, and it's not just race horses, it's actually in all horses that have been worked too young before the pelvis is mature. And what I was seeing is that the pelvis was collapsing inwards, and that the tuberosacrals would often be resting against one another. And you would see along the line where the pubis symphysis meets that the top portion of the pubis symphysis would be fused, and the ventral portion, meaning the bottom portion, imagine you're looking up at the bottom of the horse, that portion would remain open. And I was seeing this injury in older horses. Some of the horses that I've got in my collection where the pelvis is completely unfused can be upwards of 13 years old. Now that portion of the pubis symphysis is meant to fuse between 5 and 6 years old, give or take between a mare, a stallion or a gelding, because it appears that the hormones have a large impact on the growth plate closure times. So as I deep dived more into this problem, and obviously you guys know I dissect a lot of race horses, and so I'm seeing this problem in the highest occurrence in race horses. So this year we are delving into a study with a vet and a couple of other academics to put together a good baseline of what a healthy pelvis should look like. Now, I had this conversation recently with a vet where they said to me that this is a normal variation, and I said, okay, it might be normal, but is it healthy? And that's what we don't have a really good handle on at the moment, is what is a healthy morphology for a pelvis. Problems I see go hand in hand with pelvic collapse is it's not so much the sacroiliac joint itself, and this is where veterinary science, I think, has missed the mark a little bit, because it gets stuck looking at pathology in certain areas of the horse's body. So we get very stuck in looking at the sacroiliac joint, because horses will often react on palpation over top of the sacroiliac joint, and sometimes you can actually pinch the tuberosacralis together and get a reaction from the horse that way. From my perspective and what I see, what often does not happen and go hand in hand with the sacroiliac joint and pelvic collapse is actual problems in the joint itself. So the sacroiliac joint, I'll quite often see a collapsed pelvis, and the sacroiliac joint, very, very clever. Even if the pelvis has fallen inwards and there's been a subluxation of that joint, if the horse is immature enough, I'll actually see that new fibrocartilage and new hyaline cartilage has been laid down in the new orientation of the joint itself. The problem I see is that the pelvis in a mature horse is meant to be a loading apparatus for the hind legs. So meaning when the horse sits in the start gates, or when they sit to come over a jump, or when they naturally engage in the canter stride, if the pelvis is too loaded and that pubis symphysis is not fully fused, that over time we can get a repetitive strain injury by way of the pelvis collapsing inwards and the sacrum subluxating downwards. Okay, now on the face of that you might think, okay, well that's not such a big problem. But it depends on what issues are going hand in hand with that. So if you have sacral bone spurs, the body has laid that down in order to stabilize that joint. So stop the joint from moving. Now, it's true that the sacroiliac joint does not flex in the same way that a lumbosacral junction flexes, but it does have shearing forces, and shearing forces have been documented for a long time. I've got my book here, Adam's Lameness in Horses, and it describes the joint as being prone to shearing forces and talks about hunter's bumps, and then also the issues that are transferred forward onto the lumbar area or the thoracolumbar area. What I see go hand in hand with the collapsed pelvis is overlapping transverse processes. I'll see sometimes some kyphosis or lordosis, kissing spine type injuries in the skeleton of the lumbar. So that's either where the DSPs pull away or they override and crowd. A lot of this, I think, has to do with the makeup, the morphological makeup of the hind end. So, for instance, if you have a sacralized lumbar has a restricted amount of movement anyway, and so I'll often see that those horses do not collapse inwards as much as a horse that has got a well-placed lumbosacral junction, and so therefore a lot more flexion of the pelvis and can transfer a lot more force up into the pelvis. So it's a really massive issue, and we're not just talking about bony changes. You know, I haven't even touched on the nervous system that is close by. You know, I often see dysfunction in the iliopsoas muscles, and between the psoas minor and the psoas major runs the massive femoral nerve branch, and then in the lumbosacral junction you've got the ischiatic nerve, which of course goes all the way down the hind leg. So the secondary problem of that is as the pelvis collapses inwards, and depending on what other comorbidities or other problems we've got in the area, we can often find that the feedback loop through the nervous system is actually disrupted. And so then preperception becomes a problem. And that's why I'll often see that these horses have sloppy stifles, or they have hocks that move laterally when the joint is designed to pretty much only move backwards and forwards. I'll see negative palmar angle in the hinds because they are loading the hooves abnormally. And so it really becomes a whole horse problem. Now, if you've got a problem in the hind motor of the horse, which is what is happening in all this hind end collapse stuff, that those forces are transferred onto the lumbar and onto the thoracic spine. And so I don't think it's any coincidence that thoroughbreds have a higher prevalence of kissing spine for two reasons. Genetically, I see that the DSPs themselves are actually larger in thoroughbreds than standardbreds as their racing counterpart. And so that in itself is a big problem, but also because the canter, the gallop stride, is extreme extension of the spine and then extreme flexion of the spine. So the spine has to do this in the extension phase, and then in the flexion phase, it's lifting up, okay? So that spine in itself is immature. The caudal and the cranial, which just means heading towards the head and heading towards the tail, those growth plates are unfused in young horses. I've seen thoroughbreds where the caudal aspect of the growth plate is still completely unfused at 4 years old. And so this becomes a multifactored problem. We're not just looking at skeletal variations, we're looking at soft tissue problems at the same time. I'll often see that medial glute is underdeveloped in these horses. You'll find that the hamstrings are very tight and under load, so you'll see some muscles are in extreme hypertrophy while some other muscle groups are in atrophy, and that is because the pairing muscles are just not working correctly with one another, and then you'll see an altered gait come from that. So quite often what happens with these horses is they do not use the hind suspension system, remembering that the hind end is very well adapted to load and be used as a spring, okay? So the propulsive forces that are generated from the hind legs, those forces have to travel up, okay? And because of where the femoral head attaches into the acetabulum or the hip joint of the pelvis, those forces are transferred inwards. And if you look at a cross-section of a horse's hind end, we've got a lot of musculature and weight on the outside of the pelvis. And if you look at the inside of the pelvis, you've pretty much just got pelvic floor muscles, and there's not a lot pushing it back out again. So for me, it's not about looking at the pathology in the sacroiliac joint itself. It's about looking at where those forces are transferred to once the sacroiliac joint and the pelvis is not allowed to act as it should, which is a suspensory apparatus, okay? And in the vet text, they'll talk about the joint being prone to shearing forces, okay? So yes, the sacrum does move. It does not move in the flexion that we would expect it to move when you look at the horse's hind end. That is the lumbosacral junction and then the intertransverse joints. And the intertransverse joints themselves can have problems. I'll see anything from one intertransverse joint on the left and the right side, and then sometimes they can have asymmetrical intertransverse joints ahead of that. So there's lots and lots of variations on a skeletal level that I think are an inherited genetic component. Then you can have things like a transitional rib, and that can sometimes be unilateral or bilateral. And so this is a multifactored problem. And what we don't have at the moment is a baseline of what a healthy pelvis should look like. So I'm not saying that collapsed pelvis on its own is a problem, but it certainly means that the hind end will not act as it should, and those forces have to be transferred somewhere else in the horse's body. And until we start looking at the horse's body as a whole and interconnected, and we just are narrow visioned in specific areas like the sacroiliac joint, we're really not going to move ahead with understanding the hind end of the horse. Really interesting, in Ireland recently we had a vet attend the dissection, and she bought her sacroiliac needles and was able to explain to people that actually the sacroiliac needle does not go inside of the joint space itself. What it is doing, it is treating the area for inflammation localized, which means that they are helping short term with inflammation, but that inflammation will often not be just located in the sacroiliac joint. It will sometimes be in the lumbosacral junction, in the intertransverse joints, and then also the transverse processes themselves can restrict the movement in the lumbar. So once the lumbar is restricted, then those forces have to be transferred onto thoracic spine. And so you see, it's not just a problem in the sacroiliac joint. It's not just a problem in the pelvis and the collapsing of the pelvis inwards. Those forces are transferred, from feet to hock to stifle to acetabulum. And when I see horses that have had a fully collapsed pelvis, I'll often see femoral head changes as well due to the new positioning of the femoral head in relation to the pelvis. So it's a massive problem. A study is needed. We need a good baseline of what a healthy pelvis looks like, not just a normal pelvis. Just because you see something all the time does not make it healthy and functional. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to move on to a couple of passages from Adam's Lameness Manual. This book is an absolute Bible, and it was first published in 1969. I have the 4th edition of the copy, and there has been many more editions put out since then, but I'm just going to cover what the book says. What stands out to me is his connection, even in 1969, between pelvic issues and the thoracolumbar region. So, etiology: falls, slipping, and any other trauma that causes twisting or high stress to the sacroiliac joint can cause the lameness. Rooney feels that the sacroiliac arthrosis and subluxation results from repeated trauma rather than a single event, and it is probably an important underrated entity in harness racing horses. I would argue that it is a high entity in gallopers as well, but I'm not sure how much this book was based around thoroughbreds as well, but I see it in just as high prevalence in thoroughbreds and standardbreds equally. The next section, which is the thoracolumbar spine, that's the lumbar spine, and he makes a very interesting remark at the bottom here under signs. He says the typical signs of a hunter's bump should be noted, refer to the sacroiliac subluxation. The lateral curvature of the thoracolumbar spine is best appreciated from above while the animal is standing square on all 4 limbs and the head and neck are held straight. Abnormal curvature of the thoracolumbar spine may indicate either vertebral injury, malformation, or muscle spasms. The clinical signs of subluxation of the sacroiliac joint are highly variable. Usually stiffness and pain in the hindquarters are shown, with considerable variation in the signs. Pain may be produced when pressure is put on the tubercocci to cause rotation of the pelvis and move the sacroiliac joint. There is often some surrounding muscular pain caused by spasm of the surrounding muscles in their attempt to re-establish the rigidity of the sacroiliac joint. The condition is most often chronic, and the tuber sacrale may become prominent, otherwise known as a hunter's bump, either unilaterally or bilaterally, depending on if one or both sides are involved. The prominence of one or two of the tuber sacrale, known as a hunter's bump, is due to subluxation of one or both of the sacroiliac joints. Crepitation can sometimes be produced by applying finger and thumb pressure over the sacroiliac region, causing the horse to exhibit lordosis, that's dropping away. Rooney describes 2 acute cases in which the horses went down and were destroyed. He also describes shortening of the stride, limitation in the hind limb joint movement, and reluctance to jump. The lameness may be unilateral or bilateral depending on whether one or two sides are involved. And this is what I really commonly see in horses that have got the sacral bone spurs, because the sacral bone spurs can be unilateral or bilateral. And what they're attempting to do there is stop the sacroiliac joint from the shearing forces between the ilium and the sacrum itself. Okay, so the first specimen we're going to look at is a pelvis from a 25-year-old Appaloosa mare. She had a relatively easy life. She never had any foals. She was started at a reasonable age of 5 years old. And she's a really interesting specimen to look at because she still has a really beautiful distance between the tubersacrales. This mare was about 15 hands, probably maybe slightly smaller. She wasn't a big mare. But she was retired from riding at 16 years old for other problems, so not pelvic related. So she's an interesting one to look at. You can see that she's got a beautiful pubis symphysis. It's nice and thin. We can see that the back portion of the pubis symphysis has not yet fused, and that is really common because the front portion of the pubis symphysis is actually a hyaline cartilage connection, and the back portion is a fibrocartilage connection that ossifies much later. And that really is to allow the pelvis to move cordiocranially backwards and forwards until they reach the mature age of mid-teens, and then at that point it starts to fuse. So she's partway through that process. If we look at the underside, you can see that on the underside it's almost pretty much fused. If we look at the pelvis itself and I pull the tubersacrales together, you can see that she's got a really nice, rigid, strong pelvis. Part of that is because of her age, but this is the way that the pelvis is actually meant to function, okay? So the sacroiliac joint attaches here under the base of the pelvis. So I'll make sure I get that right. Yep, so sitting there like that. And if we, again, flex that pelvis, you can see that the sacral joint, where the sacroiliac joint is between the sacrum and the ilium of the pelvis, that it is meant to move, okay? So it doesn't move like this. It moves through shearing forces, okay? Remembering that the hind limb attaches here at the hip joint through the acetabulum, and that the force of the hind limbs is what actually pushes that pelvis inwards. Now, this is a very strong pelvis. I cannot elicit much movement from that pelvis, and she's actually got more movement on the left side of the pelvis than the right. You'll notice that instead of coming together to one another, the left side sort of comes more flexibly to the right side, and that is quite often what I'm seeing in these horses, is that they are one side dominant, the same as us. Next, we're going to take a look at one of my standardbred specimens. So this is from a 5-year-old standardbred who did have a collapsed pelvis. His were touching, and what we can see here is that pubis symphysis is fully unfused, okay? So fully unfused. So when that pelvis is fully unfused, we've got a lot of capabilities of the spine's movement. Okay, so we've got backwards and forwards, and then we've also got apart and away from one another. So you can see how much that sacrum would be moving when the pubis symphysis is fully unfused, okay? Now, this is a dramatic rendition, obviously, because I do not have the soft tissues attached to this pelvis. But through the forces of the hind limbs, which have massive capabilities for force, this is what is happening just in very minute levels. And if you're a racehorse, then you are prone to those forces on an almost daily basis, and so it becomes a repetitive strain injury. This is the pelvis from a 14-month-old standardbred. You can see that the pelvis is still in two halves, but we can actually see where the join has been through the acetabulum when the pelvis starts in 4 parts, that at 14 months old, that is only just finishing its fusion process. I've recreated the pubis symphysis with a piece of glue there, and that's about the thickness that it was when I dissected this young horse. Now, the pubis symphysis is meant to fuse together in a nice, even fashion, okay? It's not meant to fuse like this, and it's not meant to fuse open like this. It's meant to just gently ossify through way of osteoblasts and then become one piece of bone. Now, what I should add at this point is that I do see morphological changes or differences between breeds, okay? In thoroughbreds and standardbreds, this portion of the pubis symphysis is actually wider. If you look at any of my crossbred specimens, you'll note that the pubis symphysis is actually a lot thinner. And through dissecting young horses, I have learned that this portion of the pubis symphysis is a hyaline cartilage connection, and this portion, which actually goes on to the tuba ischi, is a fibrocartilage connection that is meant to ossify over time, but it seems to be on a different schedule than this part of the pubis symphysis. Okay, so here I've got my pelvis from my foal. Now this was a purebred Shire foal that unfortunately never made it earthside, but what I would like to show you here is that this is the base of the pelvis, this is the pubis symphysis, and you can see very clearly that this pelvis is in 4 parts, okay? So this is the growth plate through the acetabulum that I was talking about before, and that's where the pelvis itself meets like so. And that is what makes up the acetabulum or the hip joint for the horse, and that is not fused until sort of about the 14 to 16 month age mark. This is the pelvis from a Grand Prix show jumping pony. She was about 13.2, and she had a relatively successful sport horse life, and then was put down at 26 for arthritis. Some of my bone specimens are a wee bit unclean. I'm absolutely swamped with specimens, and so most of my specimens are cold water macerated or composted. She's a really cool one to look at because you can see that she's still got 2 finger spacings. The pelvis has collapsed inward slightly, but what we don't have go hand in hand with this is the sacral bone spurs, and that is due to, I believe, her later starting in life. Okay, so even though the pelvis is collapsed, slightly, ever so slightly, not very much, not enough that I would be worried about. You can still see that she's got a lovely lumbosacral junction, and that she does not have any sacroiliac dysfunction, and she does not have the sacral bone spurs. So that's what I was talking about with the comorbidity issues that can go along with it. But what we can observe here as well is, because she's got a slightly weaker pubis symphysis, that we've got a lot of movement. Now note how that sacrum moves in relation to the pelvis, okay? So the sacrum, again, it does move, all right? But what happens through maturity is that once the pubis symphysis is fused together, you lose that amount of shearing force that goes this way in the pelvis, okay? So the pelvis is meant to load. Say you were coming over a jump, you're sitting for the jump, the sacroiliac joint loads, and then springs back open when the horse goes over the jump. It's probably part of the reason why horses have such an amazing jumping ability is due to the way the sacroiliac joint is put together in the pelvis. Very different to a human pelvis and the way our sacroiliac joint works, but that makes sense because we're bipedal and they are quadrupeds. Next, I've got the pelvis from a 28-year-old thoroughbred. Bless his soul. This is Paddy, who you may have remembered on the page. He's got an amazing amount of arthritis through the lumbosacral junction. That joint is very, very rough. And the reason that I couldn't get the sacrum out from the pelvis is because it has actually fused itself onto the pelvis. I have boiled this pelvis for 5 hours, and you cannot get the sacrum off of the pelvis. I probably could break it apart, but I don't really want to do that because then you won't be able to see all of the osseous changes that have happened along the margin of the joint here. And he does in fact have sacral bone spurs. And so that is what is happening, is the body is trying to stop this joint from moving through those shearing forces, and wants to ossify it onto the pelvis. So then you've lost an amount of functional movement. This pelvis is very interesting because this is from a 5-year-old purebred quarter horse gelding that I dissected probably about a year ago. Now he did have a slight amount of pelvic collapse, but I don't really think that was his main problem. But why he's interesting is because he's partway through the ossification process of the pubis symphysis. So you can see a nice amount of osteoblasts that have been laid down here where the bones are trying to fuse themselves together, okay? So that's quite a cool specimen to see. And again, you can see that there's been no ossification along the, I'm going to call that the ischial portion of the pubis symphysis. What's also cool to note about him is that at 5 years old, his growth plates still have not fused, and he's in fact missing the growth plate on the top of the tuba sacrale. Now, this pelvis is really cool. This is from a 25-year-old pony who was never started to saddle. And I love looking at pelvises that have not been interfered with by humans because They are so much stronger. So this pony was only about 12.2 hands, and even at 12.2 hands, you can see that beautiful distance between those tuberous sacrales, right? And she only had 3 foals, this pony. Even at this age, you can see again the fibrocartilage connection on the ischial portion of the pubis symphysis, but you can see that her pelvis has in fact fully fused together. And I'd like you to note that nice thin amount of bone through the pubis symphysis. So same thing again, we can flex that pelvis left and right and bring it together, and you can see how that pelvis would load through the sacroiliac joint. Now, even at this age, she has got beautiful sacroiliac joints. You can see some aging there, but where all of the ligaments and soft tissues attach onto, I can see that there hasn't been a great amount of strain inflicted on her body. So always really cool to see these older specimens and have them as comparisons. And lastly, this is a collapsed pelvis from a 7-year-old standardbred specimen. Now what's really cool is we can see the uneven tuberous sacrales at the top of the pelvis there. We can see how thick the pubis symphysis is if you compare it to our other specimens that we've got down there. You can see that the dorsal portion, so that's the top portion of the sacroiliac joint, is fully fused. Okay, but the ventral portion, the bottom portion, you can still see very clearly that it is open and still full of cartilage. Okay, and the reason for that is that as those tuberous sacrales fall against one another, we have that's typically what I see. So that's what will go hand in hand with the pelvic collapse injury, is that the dorsal portion will be fused and the ventral portion will still be open. Now, what do you observe about this pelvis? If we were loading through the acetabulum and the hind legs, how would that suspension system of the sacrum work? It cannot. So those forces are transferred somewhere else in the horse's body. Normally, these forces are transferred onto the lumbar spine. Now, this horse's lumbar spine is still in my tanks ruminating, but his lumbar had extreme amount of roaching through it and overriding of the transverse processes. So it's not just that the pelvis is collapsed inwards, it's the issues that go along with it. And once these pelvises collapse inwards, there is no pulling them out again. They fuse in this position, and once they have fused in this position, you're looking at long-term issues for the horse, because there is not enough in this space here pushing the pelvis back outwards again. I hope that explains everything in detail. This would be a very long video, so if you stayed with me until the end, congratulations.
So how much force does it take to break apart the pubis symphysis? The following pelvis came from an almost 9-year-old gelding who had ECVM, and you can see how easily broken apart the pelvis is.